become the responder of choice, then please join me in welcoming our speaker, Kitty Pepper.
Thanks. Are you really ready?
Yes, ma'am.
All right. What would you do if you were walking along and you were approached by a big, burly stranger, sort of like the person who introduced me? And that stranger said, "Follow me." Would you follow him? Come on, you got to talk. I can't hear you're nodding. Would you follow him? Why not?
Danger.
Yeah, danger. You know, you don't know what is out there. Well, that exact situation happened to me a couple days ago. And I'll tell you a little bit more about it in just a minute, but you might be wondering, where are we going? Where is she taking us? What do we care about the big burly stranger? In this section, you will be learning a process and getting a tool that you can use to help you better interact with people who are blind or visually impaired. You will learn how this tool fits in to the process that you know and use, so that you will be known as the responder of choice, and your peers will rest easy when they know that you are in charge of taking care of their mother during a time of crisis. What we'll do is look at the process from the beginning, from the time you meet the person to the time your job is done and you walk away. We'll talk about everything that happens during that whole time. Then I'll allow a time for questions, and then I'll put a wrap up on everything. Can those of you in the back hear me okay?
Yes.
Good. So, I mentioned this big, burly stranger. Now, this actually happened to me a couple days ago in the federal building in the city from which I come. Let's just say that the Bengals and the Reds play there. But we'll protect the name of the city. I was in the federal building and I was walking out of the building, and I heard that voice say, "Follow me." And it was far away from me, so I wasn't even sure if it was talking to me. So I said, "Excuse me?" And the voice said, "Follow me." I'm thinking, not on your life. So I said, because I'm not very athletically inclined, I said, "No, I have no reason to follow you," because I really wanted to draw some attention and hopefully some athletes who could bail me out. And I headed out the revolving door the way I was planning to go. Now, my friend Dan just happened to walk through the lobby about the time this whole thing unfolded, and so he witnessed it all. What I later learned from Dan was that this was a security officer. He was concerned about my ability to safely get out of the building via the revolving door. So he wanted me to go through the standard door. What do you think he could have done differently to get closer to the results that he got, that he wanted, than he got? Yeah, it doesn't take a rocket scientist. So if he would have come up and said, "Ma'am," and I still may not have known, but if he would have tapped my shoulder, "Ma'am, I'm a security officer here in the federal building, and I see that you're heading toward the revolving door, and I just am not sure how safe that is for you with your dog. Would you like me to help you go through a standard door?" Boy, how different things would have been. My friend told me that the look in this guy's eyes, he was not a happy camper. I was a scared one, so I bailed. But that brings me to the point. Don't ever assume, or as Dr. Cates was saying, avoid assuming that we know who you are. Because within the community or within the range of visual impairments, there's a wide scale. There's a continuum that ranges from no vision at all, which is what I have. You could almost punch me in the eye, and I wouldn't know it until you actually punched me in the eye, to people who have, quote, normal vision. There are people who have, they can see with their central vision, but they can't see peripherally. They can see peripherally, they can't see centrally. Maybe their eyes, they see a cloudy image. Maybe they can't see well centrally or peripherally. And you'll get a chance to experience that in greater detail when you attend my sessions where we do the hands-on. You will have a chance to do all of that. So just be very aware. Now, once you identify yourself, depending on the context in which it occurs, the person may not totally be convinced that you really are who you say you are. So you might need to let them hear your radio. Or you might even need to make the siren chirp. You know, chances are, even though there are a lot of people that steal a lot of weird things, probably they haven't stole your fire truck or your ambulance. We hope not. But those things can help assure us that you are who you say you are. Okay? In some non-emergent cases, you might even give the person the phone number and let them call to verify that you were the one dispatch sent. But just be aware of that it's not always obvious. And sometimes, even though a person has trouble seeing you, they might see part of you, and then a few minutes later, because of changes in the environment, because of changes in their medical condition, they may not see you at all. Lighting and contrast will impact a person's ability to see, much more than it will your ability to see. If the vision is already compromised, lighting and contrast can do a real number. So can seeing a building with all glass. You know, if you're walking along a shopping center and the wall's glass and the doors are glass, that all can prove to be very challenging. Okay, so once you've identified yourself, what's the next thing that happens in the process of working with a patient?
Tell them what you're going to do.
Okay, you're going to try to gain informed consent, right? To treat them or assess them? Am I on the right track or have I lost? Okay. All right. So you want to make sure that you do tell them what you're going to do. Demystify what the medicine is. But also, the one thing that may elude you unless you have talked to the patient or really engaged in dialogue is they may not be real familiar with the equipment that's about to be used. When I was a child, I had had foot surgery. I had casts on both feet, up to the knee. The first time I went in, they told me they were going to saw off the cast. You see where I'm going. The only saw that I had ever been exposed to was my dad's chainsaw, which he would never let me touch. And they're going to put this chainsaw thing on my legs? No! And I freaked out. I mean, I was screaming. And okay, the motor didn't sound quite like the chainsaw that my dad had, but for all I know, it was just a different motor, but it was still the chainsaw. It wasn't until the next time that they had to change that cast that I got a guy who I started to have the same old meltdown. My parents telling me to shut up, and you know, if you don't shut up, we'll give you something to cry about, that kind of deal. And the guy that was going to do the dastardly deed must have wanted to protect his hearing. So he said, hey, here, hold this thing. What? You're going to let me hold this dangerous chainsaw? So I did. He put it in my hand. And then he said, see, this is the part that cuts the cast. And I'm going to let you hold it against my skin so you can see what happens. What do you think happened when he cut off my cast? Not a problem. I was like an angel. You know, he even told me what he was going to do to make sure that that thing did not hit my skin. And he kept his word. So it really does matter that you make sure that the person knows what's going on. If you just say, give me your arm, and you start wrapping a cuff around it, is it a blood pressure cuff or is it a tourniquet, which means that the big bad needle is coming? You get a very different reaction from me. Now, also make sure that the person clearly understands the scope of the injury. I remember a time back several years ago when I was swimming on a college campus, and I jumped out of the pool, and there happened to be a starting block there that swimmers use to jump off in competitive swimming. It was in the shallow end of the pool, so I never even reached up to see if anything was there because I just assumed that nothing was there. Whacked my head, and Kyle, the pool supervisor, came over and said, "Oh, wow, it's bleeding. Here, put this ice pack up here, and just hold it here, and that'll keep the swelling down and, cause the bleeding to stop." So, but because we're on a college campus, we have to abide by the campus policies. We have to call campus security. Along comes RoboCop. He comes in and he says, I kid you not, he said, "Oh my God, there is blood everywhere. There is blood all over the floor. We got to get 911 in here quick." And what do you think was going through my mind? I'm dying. Shoot, for all I know, my brain's laying back there too. And he just didn't have the heart to tell me. So the medics come. One of them's talking about a flashlight. And finally they say to me, "Okay, we're going to take you to the hospital in the ambulance." Now, what I failed to tell you was this was a cold January day, like 0 degrees. I had just gotten out of the swimming pool. I'm wet. They're going to take me to the hospital in the ambulance in my wet bathing suit. It's got to be bad. Talk about confusion. Kyle is losing the battle. He's saying it's not that bad, but everybody else, "Oh my God, there's blood everywhere, and we're going to take you." No one asked if I wanted to be taken. I was just told this was what was happening, and I didn't feel that I had any choice. Finally, Kyle came up and he said, "Well, wait, if we were to take Kitty to the hospital, would that be okay?" And the medic said, "Yeah, that would be fine." And after they left, Kyle had the wisdom, and I didn't even know about this or I would have suggested it. He said, "Kitty, what does your cut look like to you?" I said, "That sucker is big and it's bleeding all over the place." He said, "No, it's really not that bad. Reach up and touch it." I'm like, "Kyle, I'm afraid I'll make it bleed. I'll make it." He's like, "No, you have to own your injury." I touched it with his guidance and supervision, and it was not even as big as my finger. What was everybody making such a big deal about? I didn't want stitches in that thing. Put a little Neosporin on it and send me on my way, please. So, okay. So those are just a couple things. Make sure that your patient understands the scope, and make sure that you do get an informed consent versus telling that patient, especially if it's an adult, what's going to happen. Okay? If it's a child, make sure that you get the consent from the adult. That's all stuff that you already know. It's just applying it to this population. Okay, so now you've finished, you've gotten the person to understand the diagnosis. We're ready to move on to the next phase, which is what do you do after you've talked about the diagnosis, you've done what you can. You ready to transport them? Okay. Now, one of the big hot topics in transporting is if people have a service dog with them. What do you do with the service dog? First of all, how do you even know if it's a service dog? You can ask the patient what task the dog is trained to do. By the way, at one point people could use other types of service animals, but now they're not going to have the boa constrictor that gives them the big mighty hug when they're stressed out. You know, the deadly hug. So now it's a service dog, or in some cases, a miniature horse. Make sure that you transport the service dog with the patient. Honest. I've seen some articles and some comments from various electronic boards where some people say there is no way in heck that I will ever put a service dog in my ambulance. Those dogs are dirty. Come on, think about that. What all goes on in the back of the ambulance? Can a dog really trump that? I would hope not. So it's suggested by some that you put the patient in first and then put the dog in the ambulance. And that's because if people kind of get careless, you want to make sure that the cot leg doesn't land on the dog or that the dog doesn't get stepped on. I've also been advised by some very influential people that if you're really paying attention to what you're doing, it shouldn't matter which order, who goes in when, because you should be looking for that dog. If you're really crowded in the back, you might ask the person if it's okay if you put the dog in the front. Now, a lot of times dogs will have a harness, and I'm going to ask my assistant. Vanna couldn't make it today, so Chris is going to be here instead. Chris, would you show them what the two different harnesses look like? He's like, dude, I'm sleeping. Leave me alone.
So she has the guide harness, and he just has a standard harness. It's actually designed for mobility assistance for me. He helps me upstairs, so he'll be a few steps ahead of me, and I can just hold the handle on the harness, and his momentum helps me up the stairs, which assists my knees. But the harnesses can look very different, and you'll see that in your handout. And they don't have to have the harness.
Thank you, Chris. The other thing, too, is if the person is asking you to, like, hold the dog, I can't imagine, I haven't figured out how I would be lifted up into the ambulance whilst holding on to my dog. So make sure that you hold the dog's leash, not the harness. First, you want to point out the difference? The leash is always that thing around that attaches to the collar.
So this is always the leash, and you don't want to hold this because this tells the dog you're working, and you don't need the guide work, and the dog will be totally confused if a sighted person is asking the dog to guide, because the tendency for the sighted person is to help control the dog. That's totally contrary to what they're trying to do.
Yeah, and you could really undo their training in a heartbeat. So always take them by the leash. I want to pause just a minute to give you a chance to ask some questions before I wrap things up. Okay, this is good.
What do you do, like, if you or your partner is extremely allergic to animals?
Well, that is interesting, and the ADA does address that. Your allergies would have to be so bad that you would go into like anaphylactic shock. You know, if it's just the case that it's going to mess up or, you know, make you feel like you've got drainage or, you know, you can still breathe. You know, in a big space, we'd say, let's put you on one side of the room and the dog on the other. But in an ambulance, if there's not that much space, the dog still gets to go. I mean, it would have to be like literally killing you. And in which case, you probably wouldn't be able to be a medic. Other questions?
Kitty, have there been cases where you've had, this is Sherry, go ahead, or you've heard of friends of yours that have maybe been critically ill or injured, and maybe even the dog is ill or injured, and they get separated, and how the dog behaves, or does the dog get upset, let's say, are there cases out there where the human is receiving CPR and maybe the dog doesn't understand? Just curious.
So are you curious about what would the dog do to the responder?
Yeah.
I would say that it is highly unlikely that a responder would ever be bitten. And the reason that I say that is because of the temperament of the dogs that are used as service dogs. Yes, the dog is going to be stressed out. The dog is going to know that there is something wrong with their person. That's a given. I mean, I can just, have the stomach ache one day. And if I'm laying around, moping around, I can get some good sympathy from my girls. It's worth it sometimes. But they know. But again, if you are calm when you're approaching the person, you don't kind of threaten the dog, say, get out of here, move out, whatever, then, and the closer the dog is to the person, then the better the situation will be all the way around.
One other question I have too, we were talking about this morning. Let's say in an emergency situation, the person gets taken to the hospital, ends up, let's say, going to the operating room. Who becomes responsible for that dog then? Who would they call? Because they would have their own established friend that they know at home that would come and help us?
You would certainly try to get that, and I know I have a network of friends that I could call, but if I am really incapacitated or whatever, you never know when I'm going to regain consciousness. Obviously, the dogs can't go in a surgical room, in the operating room. But if there's a place, if there's an enclosed room, you can easily tie the leash to a desk or something, fasten the leash. Usually that's a good temporary solution. And, you know that it's a temporary because somebody is going to come or the person's going to come out of surgery and be able to resume control of the dog. Now, and Marilyn will talk about this shortly, if you lose control, if the person's unconscious, technically you could refuse to transport. But the problem with that is that the person may regain consciousness. And then where's their dog? So I encourage you to make every effort to transport and keep the dog and the patient close together. We have time for one more question? Okay, just to summarize in closing, we have talked about how you basically can modify the process that you use. I say it's the AAA. What's AAA? Come on, what's AAA? Normally, what's AAA? Yeah, in this case, it's ask, avoid assuming. Okay? So always make sure that you ask the questions. And there are some handouts I'm going to refer you to in your bag. This one, whoops. Oh, can you all see that? Okay, that's tips for first responders. Excellent resource. This one, how am I doing? Okay, this is healthcare professionals. This is one that was recently put out by the Ohio Governor's Council. Yours truly was heavily involved. That one has really brief information for healthcare professionals. And last, this one is Service Dogs 9 to 5, and it gives you some information about service dogs, and then the back page actually has a lot of pictures of various types of service dogs. So, in your work, remember AAA, ask, avoid assuming. And attend my session this afternoon, or when it comes your turn, you will get more information about some other ways to transport people with vision impairments other than if they use a guide dog. Some people want to hold onto your arm, some people use canes, and we'll talk about all that later. Okay? That concludes my presentation, And I'm now going to introduce our next speaker, who is Marilyn Tobachman. Marilyn joined the Ohio Attorney General's office in the Civil Rights section in 1994. She is a graduate of the University of Michigan and received her law degree from Cleveland Marshall College of Law in 1983. She was a partner in the firm of Kramer and Tobachman, LPA, and associate director of the Housing Advocates Incorporated prior to joining the Attorney General's office. She is currently an adjunct professor at Cleveland Marshall College of Law, one member of the faculty teaching the Fair Housing Law Clinic. Ms. Tobachman has been a consultant to the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, as well as to the Ohio General Assembly and its Joint Select Committee on School Desegregation. She has performed similar responsibilities for the Ohio Department of Development, the Lake County Planning Commission, the Columbiana County Department of Development, and the City of Lorain. She has co-authored articles on predatory lending, employment class actions, accessibility, and landlord-tenant law. So Marilyn will talk about how you can play by the rules. And with all of her accomplishments, I advise you to take her advice and play by the rules she tells you. Marilyn Tobachman.
I am so delighted to be here and so impressed with my introduction. Thank you. As an attorney, I'm not accustomed to being this far away from my audience. The courts always say, approach the bench. So I've gotten permission by carrying this around to do that, and I hope you won't mind. This is a very personal subject for me. As an attorney with the Attorney General's office, as much as our job is to litigate, in this case, on civil rights statute, it is also our job to prevent discrimination. Oh, is that what I'm supposed to do with it? Thank you.
That way the camera can hear you.
Good enough. Thanks so much. So, to the extent that you understand what it means to violate the Americans with Disabilities Act and avoid adding to the stress of someone who is in an emergency situation, I certainly have moved farther along the issues of law that I care about. And what is so interesting in this area of law, because the Americans with Disabilities Act is talking about discrimination based on disability. And all of us know what the word discrimination means and what it requires of us. It requires we teach everyone the same. And we don't treat anyone less because of their race, their religion, familial status. But when it comes to disability, discrimination means something else. And that's the part that it's important for you to understand. And it would help answer that question about, what do you do with the assistance animal in an emergency situation where the assistance animal may get in your way, you're worried about someone who is allergic. All the rules you have when it applies to a person with disabilities is you treat them better to be sure you are treating them equally. Any rules you have, such as an accident, mother and daughter, and you take the mother to the hospital and you're not concerned about the child, that doesn't count in this. Any rules you have about children can't be in some location, that doesn't count here. An assistance animal is like the arm or the leg, an appendage of the person with a disability. And if you have an emergency personnel who in fact is allergic, then you need to anticipate that potential problem and figure out an alternative so you have given full service to that person with a disability. Otherwise, the courts will say you have discriminated. And that's what we're here to talk about. You know, the law doesn't really describe what your responsibilities are, and it merely says that no qualified individual with a disability shall, by reason of such disability, be excluded from participation in or denied the benefits of the services, programs, or activities of a public entity. That doesn't tell you very much, but it does say that discrimination also means excluding from participation in or denying benefits of services because of that disability. When you refuse to deal with the assistance animal, you have refused service. And that's the bottom line. And there has to be a way through. And what is even more interesting about this law and the regulations that have been issued to enforce it is you have practically no options except to verify that this is an assistance animal for this person with a disability. So the simplest question is the restaurant. All a restaurateur can ask is, are you disabled and does this animal assist you? That's it. You have no right to any more information than that. It's a little simpler with someone who is visually impaired and has a seeing eye dog, because invariably they have the halter, you know, they have the insignia of being an assistance animal, but they're not required to. And there are many disabilities that are not that obvious, and there are many people with disabilities who don't use those facilities to control their dog, and they're not required to. So that if you approach someone to whom you're going to give service and they have a dog with them, you only can ask those two questions. Are you disabled, and does that dog assist you? And that's all you can ask. Now, people say, well, maybe it's really a pet. It's, you know, someone is just trying to get their pet into the hospital, into the ambulance, wherever. You take a person at their word. And that is how the law is designed. You take a person at their word. Is that difficult? Well, most of my work is with rental housing, and landlords have a lot of trouble with that. They think people lie all the time. And maybe they do. And they think that doctors will give notes and give permissions to almost anybody for the cost of a hospital visit. For persons employed as you are by public entities, under the Americans with Disabilities Act, you are not allowed that kind of concern. You ask your two questions, and that is all you're allowed to do. And it is important to anticipate what the complications of following the law will require. And that is really why I wanted to be here and why I was so grateful that Kitty thought of me to come, because it's part of it. All the questions you asked are absolutely reasonable and appropriate, but the law doesn't say that. It says you must anticipate what might occur and be prepared for it. And if you don't, the law will hold you individually liable, it will hold your department liable, and it will hold your community responsible for failing to train you. All right? And those can be costly liabilities. And so I can give you some case stories, but let me just say, as I talk to you, I'm out here because I want you to interrupt me if you have a question, if you need a fuller explanation of some of the things I talk about, if you've been in a situation that you wonder whether you handled it correctly. My question to you before I go any farther, has any of you had to deal with an assistance or service animal? Oh, good. Would you tell us what the circumstances was and how it went?
Where I worked for a paycheck doing that, we had to transport a gentleman from Marietta to Riverside and Columbus, and he had his dog with him. And I just assumed it was a service dog, didn't even bother asking that. I asked him what the dog's name was and how I could best deal with it. And we had a very small vehicle, but, and the dog was big. Got him up in there, and he laid down next to the patient all the way up. We had no problems. I talked to the patient and the dog on the way up. When we got there, since I'd been with the dog, I took his leash, not the halter, the leash, and we went out to the grassy area, and he did his business, and then we went back in, and it was over with. But it went very smoothly, and we had no problems.
I have to tell you my single personal experience with an assistance animal. I went into court for a temporary restraining order. A woman was going to be evicted from her rental unit because she refused to provide all the information the management felt they had a right to about her and her dog. And that kind of intrusion is unlawful. And the Ohio Civil Rights Commission gave me the authority to go into court to prevent that 30-day notice to vacate. We made the mistake of going in on a Friday afternoon. You don't go into a courthouse on a Friday afternoon. And I'd forgotten that. We were worried about the 30-day eviction. If they start the eviction process, can the common pleas court prevent the municipal court from going forward? It gets very complicated. And so we were anxious to go in, and we got there about 1:15, and you file your papers, they assign you a judge, and you go up to the judge's chambers, and there's nobody there. It's Friday afternoon, okay? And so, there's always someone around, and they send you back down, and they try to find another judge who may be around. There should be an administrative judge, and fortunately, there was a continuing legal education program ongoing. There were some judges sitting in there. We were in the courthouse for 3.5 hours before we got to, in fact, talk with the court. During that time, we had been in 3 different courtrooms, up and down the elevators twice, with the assistance animal, who never made a sound, who wherever we went followed, and sometimes led because the individual had a mobility limitation. Laid down next to her wherever we were. When the judge came in, didn't notice. When the judge left, didn't notice. And again, for 3.5 hours, we didn't worry about the dog needing to do its business, nothing. The dog was there. And what I like to think about and what you experienced was that dog was working. That dog was working, and the most important thing is to not borrow anything you know about the dogs you've had, your neighbor's dog, the dogs you've been confronted with. A working dog is a completely different type of animal. And so a lot of the things we assume about dogs is kind of a level of discrimination. What is discrimination? It's presuming certain stereotypical behavior. And in my business, it is, the landlord who assumes children make noise, who assume African Americans don't pay their bills. These are the kinds of things we talk about as discriminatory. And assuming that the dog will react, will bite, will need to be taken out, All those presumptions that we worry about are really stereotypical, discriminatory attitudes. These working dogs are different. And that is the first thing we need to assume about them. Because the other thing that the law does say, and it's really what we heard from our first speaker, your safety is the most important thing. That is the number one. In order for you to perform the services you've been trained to perform, and that we in the community rely on, it's your safety is at issue. And any dog or assistance animal that would in fact, cause you to be concerned about your safety by their conduct, not by any assumption, is something for you to in fact, react to and take what actions necessary for your safety, as well as enabling you to do the job you were there to do. Any questions? Okay, let me give you some examples. And I guess what I need to tell you is everything I know, some judge told me. And I get smarter every time they rule. And sometimes I'm surprised by the way they rule, and sometimes I'm totally wrong about the manner in which I expect them to rule. So the law is very much an evolving thing. And so all I can do to give you a sense of what your jobs are is to in fact tell you how courts have looked at various situations. Brenda Sears appeared at the courthouse with a service animal. She was to appear as a witness in behalf of her friend's son. The officer at the security checkpoint informed her that dogs were not allowed in the courtroom. Dogs are not allowed. Okay. She doesn't have a dog with her. She has a service animal. The officer, she provided the officer the papers she had with her, which she's not required to carry, that explained it was a service animal and how they are required to be allowed in public places. The officer took them to the judge's clerk. The judge's clerk said, "The judge is out to lunch." So she waited an hour and a half until the judge returned, reviewed the papers, and gave her permission to enter the courtroom and be a witness. Ms. Sears sued, sued the county. By the time she sued them, they had adopted a written policy regarding service animals and posted it conspicuously in all its public buildings and trained their personnel in its application. The court ruled there was no intentional discrimination because the county had never been confronted with this situation in the past. Then there's Annette Sheely. Annette Sheely sued the medical facility because it refused to permit her service dog to accompany her while her child received magnetic resonance imaging. The trial court dismissed the action because subsequently the medical facility changed its policy. The case went up on appeal, and the Court of Appeals said, wrong decision. It was a situation that could reoccur. The medical facility had defended itself by saying they had done nothing wrong. And the court said it's foreseeable it could happen in the future, and remanded the case back down for emotional distress damages that are available for such an injury. So the lesson there is, you want this protection. You want your agency, your department, your community to adopt a policy on how they are going to deal with assistance animals. And there are 2 policies attached to your materials. If you have this playing by the rules, does everybody have a copy? Okay. And that policy is a training facility. It doesn't simply say, we will not deny services to persons who are disabled and have an assistance animal. Policy talks about the various kinds of circumstances where you will be confronted with someone with an assistance animal who needs your services. And it'll be as detailed as you could possibly make it, because again, it is a training tool. You will have annual trainings about how to handle persons with disabilities and include dealing with assistance animals. I assume that most of you have periodic trainings about non-discrimination, diversity training. Well, this is one more element to your diversity training. These are people with diverse circumstances. You have a duty to treat them better, to ensure they have equal access, and all of you need periodic training on how to handle the variety of situations that have happened in the past and might happen in the future, and a review of the case law. And then almost the most important thing is that your community identify, or your agency or department identify an individual who you can call when there is a situation that your training just did not cover. And it may be because the assistance animal is acting aggressive and you're not sure how to handle it. Or, the vehicle that has arrived can't quite accommodate the assistance animal. Or the personnel who arrived feel they're at risk, or that they'll have an allergic reaction. What to do? You need someone who has a speed dial to an attorney, to know what to do. Because I can't stand here and tell you, I can imagine all the possibilities, and you're not in a position to know how to react to something that doesn't fit your expectation. We sat here most of the morning with 3 assistance animals, and we could all feel pretty comfortable knowing it wasn't going to be a problem. But problems can arise. So the lesson here is to be prepared for that, because the courts expect you to be. And as in those 2 examples I gave you, the court within an hour and a half decided what was appropriate to do. The other case, the court said, it's over, so, no injury, no foul. And the Court of Appeals said, oh no, they weren't prepared. And so that's an injury to the individuals involved, and there are damages that have to flow from that. So, no questions?
I have a couple questions.
Good.
Again, at the risk of appearing rude, you say that you should provide more to a person who is disabled to make sure that you do right, but then you always hear treat them as an individual, as equal. Well, if you're providing additional service here, then it can be viewed as not providing the same level of service to someone else who is not disabled. So it's kind of a catch-22 in a way.
Yes, it is. And that's exactly true. And the typical reason why I end up in court is someone who says, it's not my last case, it's my current case. Case involves an apartment complex that had trash chutes on every floor. And the local fire department determined that they weren't operating properly and they really were a fire hazard and they needed to be repaired. And the housing provider decided instead to just tape them closed. Well, my client is in a wheelchair and carries an oxygen tank with her wherever she goes. And now, in order to remove trash from her unit, she has to go out to the parking lot to a great big trash bin whose opening is too high for someone sitting in a wheelchair. Besides, there's no curb cuts to that portion of the parking lot where she has to travel on her wheelchair. And so, you know, the issue is she needs someone to come by daily and pick up her trash. Or some other, you know, and the answer the landlord gives is, if we do this for her, we're going to have to do it for everyone. And the answer is no, that is not the response. You don't have to do it for everyone. It is under the law an accommodation for a disability. And that accommodation gives them equal use and enjoyment of that premises. And that's what you're doing. You are giving them equal access to the emergency services you provide by doing something extra. They can't bring their pet dog. They can bring their service animal. And that is the equality that's involved. And it's exactly what the law demands. Now, there is a point at which the accommodation requested may be unduly burdensome, and that is the terminology used, to the provider. And so it doesn't mean you have to do everything that's requested. And that's why I say you should have a policy that defines what your agency, your department, your municipality expects of you, and there is someone you can call for those situations that nobody anticipated. But there is no question, a restaurant can have a no pet rule. An apartment complex can have a no pet rule. It doesn't apply to an assistance animal. An apartment complex can have the expectation that everybody is going to go into the parking lot to dispose of their trash. There's no laws against that. It does not apply to someone who is in a wheelchair and who cannot reach the opening. You have to change the receptacle, put it someplace else, arrange for someone to come by daily to pick it up. No one is saying what the accommodation has to be, but it has to be consistent with their need. And you can, the law has a phrase for it. It's called the interactive process. And what that means is they ask for one thing and you say, well, what about our doing it this way? And it's like the suggestion Kitty made. The ambulance or the space you have for conveying the individual may not be large enough to accommodate the assistance animal. So maybe you're going to put it in the front seat. Maybe if the EMT person is worried about their sensitivity to dog dander, you say, well, maybe this time you drive, and I'll be the one in the back with the patient and with the assistance animal. Maybe you're going to call the police and say, we need your help, and we need you to transport the dog to the hospital while we take the victim. There are, any number. It depends on the capacity of, your operation, the capacity of the community, and its recognition that, there could be circumstances that really inhibit you doing what we're saying the law expects you to do, and there may be multiple ways of working through it.
If we're documenting that, then do we use the word service animal in our documentation so that our butts are covered, that we did try to accommodate? And do we need to document if we had to provide a different means to get the dog to the hospital with the patient?
I would think so, and it reminds me, I've been consistently using the word assistance animal because it's a broader term than service animal. The terminology under the Americans with Disabilities Act is a service animal. It is a presumption that the animal is trained. I have a lot of problems with that because, as I understand it, and this is, I'm not a veterinarian, just a lowly attorney, that in regard to animals who provide assistance to persons with disabling conditions, most of it is in their temperament and in their instincts, and they're not consistent even among the same litter. And my most recent experience with that is my daughter arranged to adopt, when her only child went off to college, she adopted her second dog and traveled to Connecticut to check out the location and meet the parents and visit with the litter. It was a very big operation here. And what they explained to her, the litter of 11 dogs, she could pick among any one of them and come back in 6 weeks and take the dog home. But they were going to determine whether any of the dogs were going to be dogs sensitive to diabetic seizures. It would take them 6 weeks to determine that, and those in the litter who were would be pulled out and reserved for only that purpose. Now that means out of the same litter there might be one or two and there might be none. So is that training? I don't think so. So what I know from my experience is that some dogs are just, respond and react to certain situations, are trainable, have the right temperament. And from my interaction, and I think what you've observed today, obviously, I've lived with 2 dogs in my life, and none of them would have ever done that, living in my home and with my 4 kids. Never in a million years. So they are special. So service animal because you are operating under the Americans with Disabilities Act, the terminology is service animal. And even though they are trained and probably could secure a certification of that training, the law says you can't require it. If they say it is, it is. Yes, Kitty.
The key is that the service animal is trained to do a specific task. That's your key. What task does the animal do?
Okay.
And if that animal just keeps you comfortable, doesn't really do a task, then technically it's not a service dog. And your cat cannot be a service dog. So the ADA, the new amendments are very clear on that.
And I think Kitty is accurate with regard to the law and the definitions of a service animal. But strangely enough, what the law also says is you can't ask for the certification. You can ask what they're trained to do because you can't ask what is the person's disability. You can only ask, are you disabled? And whether the dog, is a service animal or how does the dog serve you. But the woman for whom I got the temporary restraining order is a woman who has post-traumatic stress disorder as a result of an assault by her husband, who is currently in jail. And she has back problems, and she has knee problems. And the dog she has trained. The dog assists her to go upstairs and downstairs. When she walks, it's as was described here, the dog pulls her along. When she comes home, the dog will go in first and check all the rooms and come out and let her know it's safe. During the night, the dog will check on her. It will go up to her bed and lick her face to be sure she's okay. And she relies on that because she has trouble sleeping. Now, she has trained this dog. She's not a dog trainer. Is that dog a service animal? Our argument, of course, I'm working with a management company, and they want the certification the dog is trained. We'll bring that dog into the courtroom and show what the dog can do and say, that should be equivalent. And the requirements are lower in a housing arrangement because a comfort dog is, would be the assistance that the law expects in a housing situation. I can tell you that that is not the dispute you should have at the point at which you are picking up a victim in distress and having to decide whether, are you disabled and what does your dog do for you? You can ask the questions. I urge you to accept the answers. The worst thing that could happen, is everybody receives the service they need, and you have not exposed your employer to any liability. Thank you so much for your attention.